Um, I'm going to talk about logical realism, anti-exceptionalism, and theoretical equivalence. And before I get started, I just want to flag two things. One is that the talk sits at a very uncomfortable place in between a whole bunch of different sort of subfields of philosophy. So philosophy of physics, which I don't know very much about. Philosophy of logic, which in one sense I don't know very much about, even though I sort of do it, and metaphysics and epistemology. And so it's kind of like looking for its home, and feel free to tell me about things that might be helpful to me and helping it sort of figure out who to market it to, because I don't even know who that is. Okay, so what is theoretical equivalence? Theoretical equivalence is this term that gets thrown around all the time. It gets thrown around by metaphysicians. It also gets thrown around by philosophers of science, and especially philosophers of physics. And it's pretty hard, I think, to give a sort of pre-theoretic characterization of the thing that everyone is trying to get at, because I think part of what's going on in the dispute about theoretical equivalence is that there's not a lot of agreement about what it even is supposed to be in the first place. So you hear a lot of metaphysicians, like Ted Sider, I think, does this in his most recent book, the Tools of Metaphysics book. I did this somewhere. You see other people do this all the time, talk about metaphysical or theoretical equivalence being construed as there being something like there's no worldly difference between theories. Two theories are sort of mere notational variants. Sort of no metaphysical distinctions between the commitments of the two theories. And I think that's like the sort of standard metaphysician understanding of this. In physics and science, I think things are a lot more complicated. So some people say extremely similar things. One person who says almost exactly the same thing is Jill North in her forthcoming very excellent book. But you also hear people saying weird things about theoretical equivalence being this thing that lives in the philosophy of physics or the philosophy of science or the philosophy of mathematics, and that is sort of domain specific, and that you can't make sort of like equivalence by the lights of physics or something like that. And sometimes there's conflation between those two things, and sometimes there isn't conflation between those two things. I'm going to say more about this as the talk goes on, but I think it's a little tricky to figure out sort of how to talk about this topic in a general way. Here's a starting observation. Every single formal account of theoretical equivalence, I'm not going to talk about any of them, but every single one that I know of assumes either sort of implicitly or explicitly that logically equivalent theories are theoretically equivalent. I don't know of any counterexamples to that. There are, however, a bunch of people, mostly within the philosophy of science, who think formal accounts of theoretical equivalence are very bad. So it's not that there aren't people who disagree with this, it's that in the sort of literature about trying to come up with sort of formal accounts of equivalence, basically everybody makes this assumption. Okay, so there's also like an implication about closure, right? A theory is equivalent to its logical closure. And also, I'm sure some of you know, the sort of old syntactic view of theories also has closure built into it. Okay, so there are a lot of critics of formal accounts of equivalence, but those critics are rarely focused on this question of whether logical equivalence entails theoretical equivalence. They're almost all focused on other questions. One exception is this Jeremy Butterfield paper that I have in the references, who I totally agree with, but he's giving a sort of science internal critique of this assumption, and I take myself to be giving a sort of extra scientific critique of this assumption. Oh, by the way, Sean was saying that people regularly interrupt to ask clarificatory questions. That's totally okay. You should feel free to do that. there's just two shorthands I have on the handout. So closure is the claim that theories are closed under logical consequence. Equivalence entailment is the claim that logical equivalence entails theoretical equivalence. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, sorry, I'm just adjusting my video so I can see you all. I'm going to just quickly talk about anti-exceptionalism. So there are obviously a lot of different ways of cashing out what anti-exceptionalism about logic is. Ulla Yortland has done a tremendous amount of work trying to sort of get clear on that stuff. I'm interested here in the sort of epistemic features of anti-exceptionalism. So I just have this quote from him on your handout. He says, at the heart of the position are three familiar Quinean claims: gradualism, which says that logical theories are continuous with non-logical scientific theories; revisionism, which says that logical theories are revisable by pretty much the same standards as other theories; and non-a priorism, that says that logical theories ultimately answer to a posteriori evidence. I should flag, I'm not going to argue for anti-exceptionalism. I consider myself to be an anti-exceptionalist. I don't think I agree with the gradualism claim, but I think I agree with the other two claims. So I think there is room to sort of make different things here, but that's not important for what's going on here. Okay, I want to try to argue that anti-exceptionalism provides a challenge to closure and equivalence entailment. And before I do so, I want to say some like very obvious dumb things about what closure amounts to in the context of scientific theories, which I hope are right. I now just said they're obvious and dumb, and now I'm worried they're wrong, but I think they're right. So, you know, typically I'm just saying this to contrast it from the scientific theory case. And in epistemology, when people talk about closure, there's often a sort of epistemic requirement where you're supposed to know or be able to recognize that there is an entailment. That's not the case here, so that's not what's at stake with respect to scientific theories. Every logical consequence of a theory is included in its closure, not just the ones we know to be or can recognize as consequences. The reason I'm saying this is that you might think that that suggests that closure is like a metaphysical thing. So what we're doing is saying a theory is equivalent to its closure under sort of whatever, if there is one, the metaphysically correct consequence relation is, or something like that. And I also just want to flag that I don't think that's the case in this literature. So I think it's sort of neither about the sort of correct metaphysical closure, regardless of whether we know whether that is the right consequence relation to be using, nor is it the case that we need to know all of the consequences of a theory or know how the consequence relation works fully. So what is that all about? Well, it's just the simple thing that we're sort of holding fixed our logic. And so if we're good anti-exceptionalists, we're doing this because we think the logic that we're using is what we have the strongest, most robust epistemic support for. But that doesn't mean we can automatically conclude that it maps onto the metaphysical facts. For the anti-exceptionalist, that should be like sort of automatically concluding that our best scientific theories, say, map onto the metaphysical facts of reality. And I think we sort of all know that we need to have some humility about that claim. And I think similarly, the anti-exceptionalist needs to have such humility about this claim. I think a similar thing is true about equivalence entailment. No one is saying that what's going on is that a theory is equivalent to now zero in on whatever the correct metaphysical facts about the right consequence relation are. No one is saying that what equivalence entailment says is that a theory is equivalent to any theory that's logically equivalent to it under the sort of correct metaphysical consequence relation. They're saying, according to our best sort of theory of what the right consequence relation is, that's the thing that we're talking about. Okay, so that's just like me hurling something that's really obvious at everybody for a reason. If anybody objects to any of that, feel free to yell at me, or you can yell at me later, that's fine. Now here's a simple argument. It's simple, but it's obnoxious and really loose because I couldn't talk about truth. Okay, so it's also probably not valid. I didn't even look at whether it's valid. But I know that the premises roughly support the conclusion. So I ought not have put it in premise conclusion form. But okay, so premise 1 says, we don't know what the contours of the right consequence relation for scientific theorizing are a priori. Premise 2 says we shouldn't be certain that we're correct about whatever we think the right consequence relation is. Premise 3 says something controversial, but our scientific theories aim at getting reality right. I'm gonna assume that. Premise 4 says it's better to minimize the number of claims in our theories that don't successfully get reality right. And premise 5 says if we might be wrong about the consequence relation, then closure increases the chance that our theories contain these kinds of claims that get reality wrong, and increase the chance that they contain more of those claims than they otherwise would. And the conclusion is we shouldn't endorse closure. I'm going to say much more about this, so if it sounds totally weird, bear with me. But just to piggyback on that, because I'm a metaphysician, I love helping myself to the idea that I can like have this notion of getting things right that's kind of like language neutral, external to semantics, doesn't have anything, you know, whatever, like I can fully meta language myself super high up. And I think if I do that, then equivalence entailment seems sort of to have this problem where I help myself to this notion of getting things right. It's sort of language neutral, external to the language, not internal to the semantics. And then I say like, yeah, you're holding the logic fixed, you're holding the language fixed. And so you get all this stuff. It might come out true according to your semantics. I don't care about that. What I care about is whether you're getting a whole bunch of claims in your theory that don't seem to get reality quite right. And I think that's what's going to happen if there is a metaphysical fact of the matter about what the right consequence relation is, and we have it wrong. I know there's a ton of assumptions there. I'll try to say something about one of them in a little bit. Some of them I'm not going to defend. But just to sort of spell this out a little bit more, I want to say something about a distinction between sort of core claims of our theory and non-core claims, and then talk a little bit about like what's going on here. So let the core claims of our theory be those that are sort of required to do the job that we need our theory to do, which in the scientific case is something like predict and explain phenomena. And then assume closure is true. Now on your handout, I think I say something like, even if all of your core claims, our core claims get things right, if we have the wrong consequence relation, many of the sort of non-core claims will get things wrong. That's not actually a realistic case of the problem I have in mind, because I don't want to deny that among the core claims of the theory, like the core claims of the theory need to be regimented somehow, right? So what is, I think, a realistic version of this is we have regimented the core claims of the theory. We've sort of selected a consequence relation. The consequence relation we've selected is wrong. Some of the core claims thus don't quite get reality right. But, so not all the core claims get reality right, but maybe a bunch of them do, and maybe this core set of claims does a pretty good job and is sort of like a pretty good scientific theory when it comes to predicting and explaining phenomena. Maybe in fact, the problems with it are mostly problems with logic. I don't know. But in that case, even if we sort of like select the same consequence theory, the consequence relation that we sort of think is implicit or explicit in our core set of claims, and we close under that, we are going to end up with a whole bunch of wrong claims that we sort of didn't need to put in our theory, but we did because we were committed to closure. Moreover, getting back to the equivalence thing, we're going to be committed to the claim that that wide theory that has all of those claims in it is actually equivalent to the narrow theory, the core theory, even though it's got a bunch of claims in it that don't quite get reality right. That seems a little bit odd, right? It seems like, oh no, if there are sort of more things not getting reality right here, there might be a problem there. I think it only seems odd if you're a logical realist. So I'll talk about that in the next section. But it might not seem odd at all if you think like, oh, well, these are just sort of trivial consequences of the already getting things wrong claims in core. Even if you think that, though, I think you should reject closure. I think anti-exceptionalists should reject closure. And that's because of the following kind of claims. So there's like these really strong Occamist principles we could appeal to that I think are obviously false, like don't posit claims you don't need to do the work your theory is intended to. I think that's very likely false. Sometimes it's sort of advantageous to us in various ways to have redundancy in our theories. Sometimes it's advantageous to have sort of merely representational stuff in our scientific theories. Dave Baker talks about this in a manuscript that I put in the references. So I think that principle is wrong, but I think of a sort of much weaker principle that says something like, don't include claims in our theories that A, don't contribute to the intended work of the theory, and B, might be wrong and sort of increase the chance of making our theories wrong or increase the chance of having us say more wrong things about reality. I think that seems hard to argue against. Okay, so one way of thinking about what's going on here is that only sort of trivial things should go into our theory that sort of don't, like the things that don't contribute to the intended work of our theory, those things that we need to add need to be trivial in a certain way. But perhaps if we've sort of got our logical consequence relation wrong, they won't be trivial in the right sort of way. That's one way of sort of understanding what's going on here. And we should be worried about those kinds of claims. Okay, so I think that's precisely what's true of the sort of non-core logical consequences of our core theoretical claims. And so I think we shouldn't put them in our theories unless they have some specific use or application, which lots and lots of them I think do. I don't understand scientific theories enough to understand this. But still, even if tons and tons of them do, that doesn't motivate closure, it just motivates selectively putting the logical consequences that we actually need for our theories to do the work that they want to do into our theories. Okay, most people think that I'm crazy. This, like the things that I've said so far seem completely obvious to me. So I don't know why people think that I'm crazy, but I do want to sort of back up and be like, why do people, suppose we sort of accept that it is kind of obvious. Why do people, even people whose philosophical commitments seem like they should lend themselves to anti-exceptionalism, treat closure as harmless? So a lot of the people who you see giving these formal accounts of equivalence are like hyper-empiricists. And you would think these hyper-empiricists wouldn't want logic to be like the rationalist glue that holds everything together. And so you would think that they might sort of think about being anti-exceptionalists about logic. So why are they sort of baking something that looks problematic to me as an anti-exceptionalist into their definitions of equivalence? I think there's two reasons. I think one is just the hangover of exceptionalism. If logic is a priori, if logic's analytic, closure doesn't carry the same kind of threats, I think, that it does in the anti-exceptionalist case. But I think the more important thing has to do partly with Quine and partly with just this holding the logic fixed thing. So I think a lot of what's going on is everyone's sort of assuming something that I don't want to grant to them, which is that we're just always holding the logic fixed when we're sort of thinking about these comparisons of scientific theories and whether scientific theories are equivalent to each other and so on. And something about doing that makes closure, makes equivalence entailment sort of harmless. I think there's something a little bit weird about that. So interestingly, Quine, right? Quine is like the purported father of anti-exceptionalism. He's also like one of the fathers of this move in the theoretical equivalence literature. Like he is one of the few people who very explicitly in his paper on this is like, well, it's definitely the case that logically equivalent things are theoretically equivalent. We just need something even stronger than that as well. But then he's like, oh, but of course, there's like a whole bunch of stuff that we can't capture with this. One of the things that we can't capture with this is like a notion of a theory that is not, it doesn't make sense to sort of like hold the logic fixed when we're talking about the theories. And he's like, I mean, as far as I can tell in this paper, the paper is very hard to understand. I don't know if other people have read it, but as far as I can tell, he's like, well, that's too hard for now. So let's just like stick with this thing. Okay, so that's just like a little side note about Quine. I don't understand Quine, so other people can help me out with that. But I mean, I think, you know, part of what's going on here is I don't want to be like a super Quinean anti-exceptionalist. I don't want to think, there's a sense in which it seems like Quine really did think there was something special about logic. You know, it's much closer to the center of your web of belief, for example. And there's a sense in which I'm sort of trying to push back on that a little bit and saying like, oh, well, if we sort of genuinely treat logic like the epistemology of logic, just like we treated the epistemology of science, this kind of thing that everybody is doing here just wouldn't make a lot of sense. Like, why are we doing this stuff? Okay, so I think anti-exceptionalists should obviously reject stuff that comes from the hangover of exceptionalism. I also think they should sort of reject the idea that it sort of makes sense if we think that the epistemology of logic is related to and tied up with the epistemology of science, and that logic is a science. I think it's a bit weird to sort of hold the logic fixed all the time. So I think it sort of shouldn't look too different to us than saying, okay, we're all going to do physics. Imagine sort of yourself before Einstein. We're all going to do physics sort of holding the principles of Newtonian mechanics fixed at all costs, and all of our sort of comparisons of our theories and stuff like that are going to like take that to be sort of the backdrop against which we're making these kinds of judgments. That sounds bad to me. It sounds similarly bad to me to sort of do this thing that all of these people do. Okay, I know that's a little messy. I can't really figure out exactly what I want to say about that part of things. About the epistemology side of things, but hopefully it will become a little bit sort of clearer how I think it's connected to the metaphysics side of things in what's coming up. The metaphysics side of things I've thought about a little bit more, but it's also quite sketchy. Okay, so I want to talk about logical realism. There are a lot of sort of ways that you could be a logical realist. Here are just two. You could be some kind of weird constant realist. You could claim there's some metaphysical difference between, say, the commitments of an atomic sentence and the commitments of a logically complex sentence that's equivalent to that, logically equivalent to that atomic sentence. So like this person might think there's a distinction between the sort of worldly metaphysical commitments of a sentence and then that sentence conjoined to itself. That's a weird view. It's a view I sort of like. It's just one way you could be a logical realist. You could be an entailment realist, so you could think like the entailment relation itself is what we ought to be realists about, that it somehow sort of directly reflects something about the way reality is structured. I think there are lots of really implausible versions of realism. So like, you know, the versions that I don't know of anybody who holds these kinds of views, but the version where you're like, yes, there is like that little ampersand there just directly refers to some sort of like conjunction relation in the world. Obviously, that's going to get you into a lot of trouble. And that's, I think, not a good view. But I think the sort of more general view, which just says like, oh, you're sort of saying something different from a metaphysical perspective when you say the sentence and then you say that the sentence conjoined to itself, I think that's much less wildly implausible. So some kind of like maybe syncategorematic, like realist picture where it's like, oh, you are sort of capturing something about the structure of reality, I think is actually very broadly endorsed. If you look at the metaphysics literature, I actually think almost everybody who is a realist metaphysician implicitly endorses this kind of view. Okay. So I'm not going to argue for logical realism. Just wanted to mention 3 reasons you might believe it. One, I should have talked about Josh here, but I didn't. One reason might be if you think there are sort of indispensability arguments that parallel those in the philosophy of mathematics. I mean, of course, you have to be really careful here because the indispensability arguments can't be sort of like object-centered or shouldn't be object-centered. So they can't exactly parallel arguments in the philosophy of math, which tell us to believe in entities. But you might have a sort of kind of looser indispensability argument that says something like, oh, like, you know, we can't do any of the theorizing we do as human beings without these things. Some of that theorizing we think is sort of capturing reality correctly. And so there must be something sort of reflective about the structure of whatever the right logic is to the structure of reality. That's the kind of thing I have in mind. I'm not at all convinced that those kinds of arguments work. I just wanted to mention that they are a possible reason you might believe in logical realism. Just to mention 2 other reasons, you know, maybe we need to posit laws of logic. And if we want to sort of hold on to realism about the status of our own inquiry, which we take to be restricted by those laws, we might be sort of incentivized to think that those laws come from human independent reality rather than from us, or we might worry that otherwise being a realist about our own inquiry is difficult. And then likewise, I think a lot of the sort of standard ways of being a realist in metaphysics these days sort of already commit people to logical realism. So I've argued for that elsewhere. But I don't really care about convincing anyone that logical realism is true. I care about convincing people, especially people who might be sympathetic to anti-exceptionalism, that it just might be true, like that you should have credence that's not 0 in it. So I think for the anti-exceptionalists, the epistemology of logic should be really hard. I didn't sort of present an argument for that here. I do in the paper version of this, but you know, there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of confusion about what the evidence even is. There's a lot of confusion about what a logical theory is even supposed to do. There's all these things that we're confused about epistemically. And so I think we need to be like a little bit humble about that. But I don't think it's just that we need to be humble about sort of the epistemology of like theory choice in logic. I also think there are all these other questions about logic that we need to be a bit humble about if we're anti-exceptionalism, if we're anti-exceptionalists. And I take the question of realism versus anti-realism about logic to be one of those questions. So it's like, if logical realism is true, that's because the world, at least mostly independent of us, sort of settles the facts about what the correct logic is. And if that's right, then it's sort of implausible that we would be in an epistemic position to sort of know that that was right. So I think even if we think, oh, it's very unlikely that that's right, I think we should have some sort of like openness to that idea epistemically. So basically, if we're not treating logic as sort of a priori unrevisable analytic or perhaps conventional, then we ought to be open to the possibility of there being sort of logical structure in reality, even if we think the reasons rest on the other side. Okay, so that's just to say, anti-exceptionalists should care about the possibility of realism. Okay, so, oh my gosh, sorry, I thought this would go way faster than it is. Don't worry, I'm not gonna talk for too long. Okay, so logical realism as a sort of metaphysical challenge to closure and to these claims about theoretical equivalence. I think logical realism is obviously a challenge to the claim that the sort of core of a theory is theoretically equivalent to its wider closure. If logic sort of reflects actual metaphysical structure, then the core of the theory, at least in some cases, is going to say less about how reality is structured than its closure does. But I think it's easy to sort of push back against that. So I want to say a little bit more about it. Okay, so let T narrow refer to the core claims of the theory and T wide refer to its closure. According to at least some versions of logical realism, T narrow and T wide will make two very different sets of metaphysical commitments, at least in some cases. In some cases, they'll be identical, right? There's all sorts of possible cases here. But presumably, the cases in which they're identical are very far-fetched. But so are the cases where it's like, there's sort of very little logical structure in T narrow and a lot of logical structure in T wide. So presumably, the stuff in T narrow is already going to be pretty like regimented. It's already going to be suggestive of a consequence relation. And that matters. But it's easy to construct sort of toy cases of theories where T narrow and T wide make different logical commitments. So let T narrow be the theory that only has the following two claims in it. Leroy's my dog, is black. Donkey, who's my rabbit, is gray. T wide will include things like donkey, depending on our consequence relation, like donkey is gray or donkey is not gray. It's not the case that it's not the case that Leroy is black, and so on. In those kinds of cases, I think it's easy to see what the problem is for logical realism in that toy case, right? So you're sort of adding on a whole bunch of logical apparatus onto your core claims in your theory. But we might ask ourselves, like, are there any realistic versions of this case? Here's where I need help from philosophers of science, but I actually don't think it really matters. So I think it's easy to see that if we're constant realists, which I know is like a far-fetched view, that I think all the time we're going to run into this problem, right? So you have to make a sort of choice about what kinds of logical constants you want to use. You have to sort of, there might be some sort of like not purely conventional fact of the matter about which collection of constants is like most joint carving, even holding something about your consequence relation fixed. And then you're going to run into all sorts of problems. Like, I mean, some people think, I don't think this is plausible, but some people think that conjunction is like much more natural than disjunction or something like that. And so you might worry that like your core claims have conjunction in them, and then your wide claims don't have disjunction in them. And now you're sort of suggesting that there's disjunctive structure in the world, but there is no disjunctive structure in the world. And so I think it's obvious that in those kinds of cases, there's a problem here. If you're obviously, as I'm sure you're all aware, if you're a consequence realist, it's much more complicated, right? Because we have to think about sort of whether there is a case where we would have done better by sort of not regimenting our core claims in our theory using, say, whatever consequence relation we've selected, and whether we could have done with something weaker. And then we've got sort of all sorts of things in there that reflect a consequence relation that is not implicit in the core claims of our theory. I don't think it actually matters too much whether there are examples of this, because these people who I have a problem with are implicitly assuming that it's part of the sort of definition of theoretical equivalence that these things are sort of all the same in some sense. So it's sort of not obvious to me that we need anything but a toy theory to show that this isn't right if logical realism is true. I think closure is seriously challenged by logical realism. If logical realism is true, of course, there's going to be some cases, depending on the version of realism which we endorse, where the narrow set of claims is equivalent to the wide set of claims. But I think it's also obvious that there are going to be a bunch of cases where that's not right. And I think that challenges closure. Equivalence entailment is also seriously challenged by logical realism, though not if you're a consequence realist and you're holding the consequence relation in question fixed, which is what these people are doing. So that's tricky. Okay. Let me just try to hurl these arguments together. So I think logical realism pairs best with anti-exceptionalism. It's consistent with exceptionalism. It's a metaphysical thesis. It's not an epistemic thesis. And I'm zeroing in on the part of anti-exceptionalism that's epistemic. But I think you'd have to be basically a very strong kind of rationalist to uphold both realism and exceptionalism, right? You'd have to think there is this immediate connection between sort of mind-independent logical structure in the world and your a priori knowledge. And that seems weird. So I think that they naturally go together. That's not to say that anti-exceptionalists need to be realists. That's to say that realists ought to be anti-exceptionalists. I think that no logical realist should sort of think that her favored logic is the one true logic with certainty. So if logical realism is true, I think it's sort of plausible that we actually have less evidence about what the one true logic is, if there is such a thing, than we do about many other matters of human inquiry, for example, theoretical physics. If logical realism is true, I think that the facts that settle what theory is right lie outside of us, our minds and our language. So let's just say, like, even if there was sort of no disagreement about this, we could universally agree upon a consequence relation. We could think that our evidence very strongly supported it, and we could still turn out to be wrong. I think that anti-exceptionalists should be open to the possibility of logical realism. And if they are, then I think there is both an epistemic challenge and a metaphysical challenge to closure, and in some ways equivalence entailment. Because I don't think that you have to believe realism to sort of accept that there's the chance of a problem. Okay, so real quickly, why should we care about any of this? I want to flag that philosophers of science in general do not care about any of the things I've just discussed. I want to make two quick analogies to mathematics and to ordinary objects. So we don't pack all of pure mathematics into our scientific theories. We don't put irrelevant mathematics into our scientific theories. We don't think that a theory that does so is equivalent to a theory that does not, all else being equal. So assuming they're the same other than the irrelevant mathematics, unless we're anti-realists about mathematics. If we're anti-realists about mathematics, sure, you can claim that. But if we're not, it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, I've packed all this extra math into my theory, and now I want to claim that it says the same thing about the world as this other theory that doesn't have any of this mathematics in it. But I don't think that the way we think about and define scientific theories I don't think it should make I don't think it should have a bearing on that, whether the people who are in charge of doing such a thing are anti-realists about mathematics. And I don't think anybody else does either. So the way we define physical theories and our sort of definitions of equivalence between physical theories, I think should be neutral as to whether realism about mathematics and also logic are true, unless indispensability arguments work. But if indispensability arguments work, that's an argument in favor of sort of stacking the deck for realism, not against realism. So either way, we shouldn't stack the deck in favor of anti-realism. Now, mathematics is tricky. It's, all of these theories are mathematical theories. So that makes the comparison to mathematics very confusing. But just think about chairs, which I think are a better analogy here. Plausibly, there are some facts, or there should be some facts about what composite entities there are built into our scientific theories. But it doesn't follow that because our theories support some composite entities, and perhaps the composition of those entities is consistent with something like mereological universalism or something, we should also close our theories under some principles of mereology, our scientific theories. Nobody thinks we should do that. Also, I take it that nobody thinks that doing that would get us something equivalent to our original theory unless we're already committed to the idea that there can't be a distinction between theories that posit composite objects and theories that don't posit composite objects. Right? So unless we're already anti-realists about, or anti-realist isn't even the right term here, unless we already think there's no debate to be had in the world of composition, and that all of the relevant theories are sort of equivalent to one another because they're all sort of meaningless notational variants or something, then we certainly should not think that what we'll get if we sort of pack all this stuff into our theory is something that's equivalent to the original theory. I'm also not sure why even the following, and I think this will be more controversial, but so suppose that we had a theory that did have some composite entities that sort of posited the existence of some composite entities. there's nothing that sort of requires us to identify the kind of minimal sort of principles of composition that support the existence of the composite objects that we want to posit, and then close our theory under those. I don't think that would get us an equivalent theory. I don't think anybody thinks it would get us an equivalent theory, except, again, people who think that this is all nonsense and that there are no questions to be asked about mereology and composition. Okay, so unless we want, again, anti-realism is not the right sort of, it's a metaphysical or meta-ontological kind of anti-realism. Unless we want that kind of meta-ontological anti-realism that says, like, there's no distinctions to be had here, to be baked into not just our theory itself, but the way we sort of define theories and equivalences that hold between them, we ought not do that. I think perhaps this is like a radical version of anti-exceptionalism, but I think the anti-exceptionalist, for similar reasons, ought not do that with logic. Of course, the situation is way more fraught and complicated. Like, I don't mean, I'm sure I'm coming across as incredibly naive right now. I don't mean to be suggesting that, like, we can get away with sort of not using logic in our scientific theories or something like that. I just mean to be suggesting that if we sort of pay attention to these analogies, which should, I think, look like decent analogies to the anti-exceptionalist, even if they don't look like decent analogies to the exceptionalist, they should make us pretty worried about why we're sort of making so many logical assumptions in science. Okay, I'm going to skip over some stuff here, but I just want to sort of say something about more about why we should care about this. So, like, I think we shouldn't let the way we define equivalence or scientific theories in the first place sort of rule out a thesis, logical realism, by kind of fiat, which I think is what's happening here, or at least make it seem sort of wildly more implausible than it is. So I think that if you think there's sort of no room to make these distinctions that I want to make, and you want a notion of equivalence that doesn't allow you to make those distinctions, then I think you are sort of, what's happening is that philosophers of science are kind of stepping into the business of answering metaphysical questions that, while their work might have some bearing on, of course, we should think all scientific inquiry is connected to all other scientific inquiry. Those metaphysical questions about logic are no more in their purview than the questions of whether chairs exist. So again, like, I'm sure we might think that physics or some other science should have some bearing or have something to say about whether chairs exist if it turns out that something about our physical theories has something important to say about chairs. But we shouldn't bake in the idea that there's no fact of the matter about whether chairs exist into our physical theories, just as we shouldn't bake into our physical theories the idea that there can be no fact of the matter about the metaphysics of logic. Okay. And just in terms of, like, why we might want to care about this on the metaphysics side. So sometimes, as I said at the beginning, you hear philosophers of science say things like, oh, well, this notion of equivalence that I have in mind, it doesn't matter to me at all if metaphysicians want to make more fine-grained distinctions than I want to make, because I only care about what's going on in the physics. And I think that might be all well and good, except that the world is obsessed with naturalizing metaphysics. And so the world is obsessed with the idea that, in fact, metaphysicians do have to take what science says and what philosophers of science tell them science says to constrain the kind of reasoning they can do about the metaphysical possibilities. And so I sort of don't buy that idea that, like, you can do that. I think if you want to be a realist about science and you listen to these people telling you like, oh, these two theories are equivalent, I think that's a suggestion that like there's not space for distinguishing between those theories. Also, I just want to quickly end by saying, I think actually that's like a disingenuous move. So I think some of the people who you hear saying that are people who are quite hardcore empiricists who think metaphysics is bullshit. And I think it is a way of saying like, oh yeah, you can do this, but it's just like the chairs in the example I just gave. Like, I know that these things aren't really equivalent. I know that there is no difference between a world in which there are chairs and a world in which there are no chairs. North in her book and Butterfield in his paper both sort of gesture at this. And then the last thing I wanted to suggest is like, these people, including Hans Halvorsen, who is like one of my mentors and professors, often you see them saying stuff like that and then simultaneously saying things like, oh, a theoretical equivalence, why is this important? It's important because there's this incredibly important relationship between realism and anti-realism on the one hand, and the sort of spectrum of ways you could be a realist and an anti-realist, and theoretical equivalence on the other hand. So like, why is theoretical equivalence important? Because two theories being equivalent is supposed to give us a reason to be an anti-realist about anything that they disagree over. So I think it's a bit weird to be like, this is why we should care about this thing, but also if you, Michaela, want to talk about like the metaphysics of logic, you can go off and do that, and that will somehow sort of count as inquiry. I think what's actually going on is that they think there is sort of no question to be asked there, and they would like to obscure that question. I'll just end by saying, even if people sort of dig their heels in here and say like, no, 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 you can go do the metaphysics of logic as much as you want, and we're not trying to obscure that, I think the epistemic concerns are genuine about anti-exceptionalism, creating concerns about sort of just closing our theories under whatever logical consequence we happen to think is relation we happen to think is sort of like epistemically best. And so it would be better to just reject these features of definitional accounts of equivalence. And those features of definitional accounts of equivalence are like central to those accounts. So that would require either rejecting the accounts altogether or figuring out a way to revise them that did not include that. Okay, that's all I got.